name is Angie Benfield, and I'm an occupational therapist and a professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. And I'm extremely happy presenting today this presentation on making decision-making visible and teaching the process of evaluating interventions, which is based on an article written by myself and Robert Kruger, an occupational therapist and professor at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. As any health professional who provides direct client care will always need to rely on heuristic reasoning during the client interactions, as the speed of real-time interactions does not allow for deep critical reflection in the moment. Therefore, it's really important for us to understand the mental models which underlie this reasoning. Current healthcare, science, medicine, and education all are rooted in the assumption that if we divide problems into smaller units, they become easier to solve. And they also tend to help support cognitive models that are linear, which means that one cause produces one effect. It also leads to compartmentalization of problems and knowledge, due to the way we divide up and place information in our learning activities. With this, it's really important to understand that integration of knowledge is a dynamic process, which relies on that individual synthesizing and giving weight and importance to what they know, their experiences, their beliefs, and values. And what is also, because it's an individualized process, it can lead to each profession or each person in a profession having a different mental model for their understanding of how that problem works and what needs to be done. Further, the reductionistic assumption is not accurate for many of the problems that we address. Evidence really suggests that causality is dynamic and requires one to consider many more variables and perspectives in order to appropriately weigh each factor. Secondly, factors can either directly affect an outcome or cause changes through a second factor called moderating factor. In addition, as we know with all dynamic systems, there are some factors that can produce huge effects with less efforts, while other factors can still cause change to that outcome, but require significantly more effort. One example of a causing versus moderating factor is organizational climate and EBP implementation. Historically, organizational climate has been framed as a causing factor for the rate of evidence-based practice implementation. Many interventions have been developed to change organizational climate. Current evidence also suggests that organizational climate may be a moderating factor, which means that it's influencing evidence-based practice rates, but it's doing it through a different factor. While others, such as myself, posit that we may actually have the relationship arrow going the wrong way. And by this, an individual self-selects to work in a place where they are much better fit to the expected rates of evidence-based practice implementation. The significance of this example is that errors in the conceptualization of the relationships and the importance of the effect of those relationships on an outcome can lead to selecting interventions which are less effective or have no effect at all. Selecting an intervention is an extremely complex thinking process. It requires the integration of two separate processes: the accuracy and richness of the person's causal model, which is used to define and solve the problem, and the quality of their ability to analyze the intervention used using intervention theory. This diagram is a simple view of this process, as it would also include really thinking about and reflecting on all the skills and knowledge within their scope of their professional domain, socio-political aspects, and also cultural and local context aspects. However, When we look at the selection of the quote unquote best evidence-based intervention, it really does require the person to be using an evidence-based causal model to inform this decision-making process. The relationship between the causal model and the intervention is synergistic. The causal model drives that person's understanding of what factors need to be assessed and identifying which factors are most likely to cause changes or be able to change an outcome of interest, and which factors can be ignored. On the other hand, it is the intervention theory which tells the person which factors are affected by the intervention activities. And due to this complexity, there are many places that this thinking process can go awry. And the deeper, more accurate the causal model and the deeper and more accurate analysis of the interventions, the more likely it will be that the intervention is accurately represented in their mental model, and that their mental model is accurate to how the world really works. Specifically, in this mental model, the evidence-based information actually supports the accurate weighing of the causing, moderating, and no need to think about factors in the decision-making process. This is an example of an evidence-informed causal model of an occupational therapist. When we look at this, causal models are another word for the mental model, which is used to represent the individual's personal theory of how the world works for a specific population, and then is used to gather information from the client and the context in order to do that patient match to his schema to decide if the patient has a problem or not, and if the factor is involved with this specific client or not. When we think about causal models, they are probabilistic. Each identified factor in the model is really weighed by how likely that individual variable is believed to be causing or influencing the outcome. Evidence supports that this weighing is consistent with Bayesian inference. Why is this important? Remember, every person develops their own individualized mental model, which could over time be highly accurate or totally incorrect, or anywhere in between. Evidence, such as the work of Fava, has reported that even people who have had the same training and work in the same clinic, seeing the same basic type of clients and addressing similar client problems, will have significantly different cognitive models over time due to the dynamic process of integrating their knowledge and their experience, beliefs, and values. Other research has also found that having people draw out their causal models can be very illuminative and useful. The maps can be used to identify with high degrees of accuracy what will be their most likely intervention, as their causal maps will have significantly richer and deeper connections to those factors that they believe are critically important to the presenting problem. The interventions selected will also be linked to those factors that they believe are the most likely to be causing the problem. From an ethical practice point of view, the mental model needs to be evidence informed. And by this, we need to be critically examining our beliefs, our knowledge, our skills, our experiences, and identify the evidence that we are using, or the evidence that supports that our mental model is accurate. On the flip side, there's strong evidence that really shows that new information does not really become usable for the person until they've actually manipulated it and integrated it with previous knowledge. And so, in other words, that mental model really does represent that person's current understanding knowledge, theories, beliefs, and experiences on how they understand the problem is occurring and the potential plausible activities which could be used to moderate or affect that outcome of interest. When one looks at one's causal model, they identify factors that influence the outcome. On the flip side, it's intervention theory, which helps them identify and link specific interventions to the factors that it affects. In intervention theory language, the factor that influences the outcome is called the mechanism. The target is the outcome that you would like to change. This diagram represents the complex tasks that involved intervention selection. Interventions need to be analyzed to identify the required actions that are needed to be provided in order to make a change. They also identify the theorized mechanisms of how that activity causes change. And lastly, identify what it changes. And through this analysis, the interventions are connected into the mental model of when it might be more likely or less likely to achieve the outcome. In addition, many interventions described in the literature are complex and not readily transferable to all locations and culture. Many dictate the use of multiple activities which are used in combination. However, we rarely have evidence of which activities are truly required, as they are the active ingredient which addresses the mechanism of change and causes the change. So in intervention theory verbiage, there might be some activities we do which are active that cause the change, and then we have others that are inert that we don't actually have to do because they are not actually causing change. They are just present. Where this comes really critical in importance is that from an EBP perspective, if I'm achieving the same outcomes but not doing every single activity that's identified and described in the intervention protocol, I do not need to change my interventions that I'm providing if I'm already achieving the same or better outcomes. That actually provides an indication that those activities that I am not doing might be inert activities. So it is this nuanced analysis that really helps us decide if we need to change practice or partially change practice, or if we do not need to change practice at all. However, on the flip side, there is also many places that this intervention theory analysis can go awry, and that is why I developed an intervention rubric. And this rubric is really to support the clinician in appraising any given intervention. It provides those key questions and descriptors that support making the correct decision. And importantly, I believe that it is also through the use of that intervention rubric that it really does help us develop and obtain evidence that actually supports our actions. In that, many of our interventions, we do not have a good understanding of what would fall under these areas as best practice. But through doing this deep analysis, we are better able to identify our hypotheses on what we think the activities are changing and how they're changing it. And we're able to identify high quality data points that we can use to help assess the quality of our thinking. And that is also the ethical way to change practice. Make your thinking visible to yourself, make your hypotheses about the causal mechanisms and the activities that are critical for making the change, collecting local data, and then reflecting on that outcome. And when we think about this, That critical analysis of the intervention also increases the likelihood that will be appropriately provided in the local setting. And it does really help with that local outcomes data collection, because you actually have to identify what is a good data point that will demonstrate or test my hypotheses that this is a factor that is influencing the outcome. So here's an example from a group of experienced occupational therapists who were working with children diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. When they were initially asked to reflect on and identify what are the factors they typically think about when they receive a referral, these were the variables that they identified spontaneously: ADL skills, visual perceptual, sensory processing, fine motor, and history. And when they also really reflected on what interventions they were using with their clients, every intervention that they were using linked on or mapped on to one of these factors that they had identified as causing or influencing their ability to function and participate in life's activities. However, after doing some evidence-based practice activities and really looking at developing an evidence-informed causal model, the therapist actually identified many more factors that have been identified in the literature as impacting or affecting an outcome of functional performance and participation. One critical change that the therapist reported is that after reflecting on their models, they identified many more targets, and they also identified that there were many more targets that they could actually leverage in order to meet the goal of increasing function and participation. So in other words, it really expanded the options of what actions they could take that could change the outcome. The other thing that was quite interesting is after the deep reflection on the information in their evidence-informed causal model, they ended up having a rich discussion about the factors, and in fact identified one critical new factor of responsibility. And when they started discussing responsibility, it really shifted the problem definition from one of being a lack of motor skills or a lack of visual perceptual skills or a lack of social emotional skills or executive function to a lack of taking ownership and responsibility to do the activities. However, this shift to responsibility also opened up many more interventions that targeted specifically increasing responsibility. And importantly, this evidence-based causal model also led them to start seeking alternative interventions and actually greatly expanded the range of what are plausible, interventions that have been explored in the literature and have evidence that they are affecting the outcome of improved responsibility. So in conclusion, I hope you found this presentation very illuminative, and I'm ready for your questions.